This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are joined today by horror author Grady Hendrix to talk about his new novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, out now.
Hey, Grady.
Hey. Sorry, I'm terrible at stepping on people's lines. Hey, thanks for having me.
Okay, well, number one, congratulations on the book. It is really fantastic. And I saw that it hit number one in vampire horror on Amazon today.
So I know, but it's only number 3. It's only number 3 in vampire thrillers. So I don't, it's not thrilling enough, but it is horrific enough for vampire lovers.
You know, personally, I would rather be on the horror side than the thriller side, but...
I know, but it's like, I want to be number one across the board. And it's like, oh, that 3. I'm like, what's wrong with the thrills? Why are my thrills weak?
All right. So this book was described, at least I'm just going to admit, I stole this from Amazon, the description. It says it was Steel Magnolias meets Dracula. And number one, I'm wondering if that was your plan going into the book, because that is a very odd combination to decide to throw together and see if it works.
Yeah,
it works. I love the book, but
yeah,
go ahead.
No, it's it's funny. It's I didn't really have a plan. Like, I knew I wanted to write this book for a really long time. Like, I really hated my mom's book club when I was growing up, and I sort of I got to know a lot of them as adults, a lot of her friends, and some of them were my friends' moms and things like that. And my mom and I, like, my high school years, I think, like most people, we really didn't get along very well. And then, sort of getting to know her after that as an adult, it was really different. You sort of stop seeing these people as parents and authority figures and see them as like other human beings who just happen to be older than you and have bad fashion taste. And so, like, I really wanted to write a book that was about that process of, for me, sort of going from having contempt to admiration for these women. And I, the original title of this book was called My Mom's Book Club Killed Dracula. And I think the title we got now is a lot better, but that was the title in my head for a long time. And I knew it was a vampire because I hadn't done vampires, and I feel like vampires are easily dismissed and everyone's a little sick of them. And I really like going back to first principles with stuff and sort of like, well, why was it scary in the first place? And so, yeah, it was. And so all the other stuff, the marketing lines and all that, I mean, I like that stuff and I'm a part of putting that stuff together, but that all kind of comes after the fact. Like, it's kind of like this was the book and everyone had to deal with it and figure out how to make it sound good.
Okay, so why did you decide vampires in the first place? Like, because they are, as you said, they're kind of dismissed a little bit. And I feel like, I don't know, I feel like they had a moment in time. A few years ago, vampires were really big and then everybody kind of shied away from them. So why did you decide this is the time I have to tackle a vampire?
Well, one thing I want to say, though, is vampires are still having a moment. I mean, if you look at urban fantasy, holy cow, there's so many sexy vampires and like books about vampires with like really good abs and like hot vampires. I just read this book. What was it called? The Runaway Vampire. That's like a woman hits a vampire with her RV and she's like in her late 40s driving around, and the vampire gets in her RV and he's all battered up and she feels bad for him and he's super sexy. And then like he's really in love with her because he's like, I don't care that how you look. You were the most interesting woman I've ever met. And then he makes her a vampire and she gets like young and sexy and like then they just have sex for like 100 pages. So like vampires are still having a moment with some genres. But I do agree, like they sort of aren't taken very seriously and there's a lot of eye rolling. But it was kind of fun. I kind of like the challenge, because vampires are really like, um, they're really scary at heart. I mean, they're serial killers, and to a large extent, and they're predators who never are full, no matter how much they eat. And one of the weird things, I always find these synchronicities when I do stuff, and it's probably just like I'm staring at the wall too long, and I'm like their faces in the paint. But I'm doing a lot of research on vampires, like old timey vampires, like 18th and 17th century and 15th and 14th century vampires. Just doing some show stuff, trying to get some vampire friendly content out there to help me pimp my book. And I just like researching this stuff. And one of the things that was really interesting is a lot of the early vampires like would strike when there was a plague. Like, oh my God, like we're having some bubonic plague or some cholera or something. And on top of that, as if that's not bad enough, vampires are like coming in our houses and like dragging people away and eating them. And they're the worst because they come for your babies first, and then they do the old people because old people like know how to kill vampires, and then they do the men because the men leave the house the most. And so it's this really interesting thing because you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, of course that makes a lot of sense. Here's someone in 14th century Serbia in some muddy village somewhere where like all they can do is watch like donkeys fuck or something. That's the entertainment. And like suddenly there's this thing and people are dying and no one knows why and no one knows how to stop it. And you go to bed and your husband is healthy and you wake up and he's on his last legs and he gets thinner and weaker and paler every day and you can't stop it, and it's something that comes in your house and people are giving it to each other. And so it's like this really, it's kind of interesting right now when we're sort of going through the same kind of pandemic to realize that vampires and pandemics have been linked all the way back to the beginning.
Well, and vampires are so interesting too, I think, because they are very scary monsters when you look at the original lore. But they also have that, I mean, they have like a seductive side to them too. That, especially when you look at something like Dracula, because you can't talk about vampires without talking about Bram Stoker and Dracula. But i I remember as a child being so terrified, not of like ghosts or witches or anything. I was specifically afraid of vampires. Like I thought they were under my bed and in my closet. That was just the monster of choice that I was scared of. And then my dad told me, they can't come in unless you invite them. I guess thinking that would make me feel better, but it didn't, because I thought, well, that's how they trick you. Like they infiltrate into your home. I mean, they're
Yeah, yeah.
they're not just a real like, visceral, I'm going to attack you monster. They play with your mind a lot.
Yeah. Well, wait, I gotta ask. So, what did the vampires look like? Did they look like Bela Lugosi, or like what kind of vampires were they that were under your bed and in the closet?
Oh no, they wore the long black capes and they had the black slicked back hair. Like I mean, I must have at some point. My grandmother showed me a lot of really old horror movies. So I'm
Okay.
sure at some point that got that got into my brain. But yeah, they were fully decked out, like ready to go to like a black tie affair. Yeah.
My sister, who's older than I am, she was terrified of vampires as a kid, and it was like old European, Bela Lugosi vampires. But she had this fear that, and I don't know where this came from, but a vampire would come and stand in our front door downstairs, and like its arms would stretch and like snake through the house like tentacles, and like its hands were really pale and it had like black sleeves, and the hands could like follow her wherever she went and like find her wherever she hid. I mean, it's really Freudian when you get down to it. But yeah, like just spaghetti arm vampire monster. But yeah, it is, and it's also like, I mean, there's this idea like they trick you, right? They talk to you like a zombie, a werewolf, a ghost. They just like make noises and moan, but a vampire can like interact.
Yeah, well, there's something very human about that, and I think that's frightening too, because
Yeah,
it's not, a werewolf's an animal, right? Or the creature from the Black Lagoon is something that slithers up. Like
the dummy.
that,
Yeah.
this is, yeah, this is different.
No, exactly. And it's also like something that passes for human. Like it owns property, it hires lawyers. Um, I mean, Dracula's where a lot of so like before Dracula, I mean, there were vampires that were human-y, but like Dracula's where they started getting sexy, kind of. And a lot of vampires pre-Dracula and even post-Dracula, I mean, I guess there's Carmilla, the Le Fanu story, but like a lot of them were women in the 19th century, and a lot of them, just reading through a lot of the short stories, a fair amount of them were like energy vampires. Like it was women who would just exhaust you. Um, and I can only imagine, it's like 1870, and you're like, oh my God, these women want to like play lawn tennis and like show their ankles and walk outdoors and own property, and they want it to be illegal to murder them. Oh, they're exhausting me. I'm going to write a story about women who exhaust people to death. Um, but yeah, the Dracula's where it got sexy. Um, and I think it was accidental. Like, I think it was just Bram Stoker was a really good writer, and it was all that physical detail about people getting their necks sucked on. It couldn't help but feel tactile and kind of like hot and kinky.
So how much research did you actually do? I mean, because you've mentioned, a lot of people know Dracula, but I mean, to pull up somebody like Carmilla, not everybody has read Le Fanu. So how much research did you do going into this, or how much did you already know before you settled on your vampire?
Yeah, I mean, I like vampire. I knew Carmilla before, and I knew Dracula before, and so I had a fair amount of knowledge. I mean, I really like Dracula the book. I think it's really good. I mean, I don't. It doesn't need my validation, but like I actually really enjoy it. Like I've reread it a few times, um, and I really, despite Winona and Keanu, I really like the Francis Ford Coppola version. Um, wasn't such a fan of the BBC version recently, but it was wacky, but not my thing. Um, but I do too much research when I write a book. And so a lot of it was on the 90s because the 90s are close enough that they don't quite have their own identity yet, but they're still far enough away where it's like, even though I was, I was in college in the 90s, but like I just needed to understand it better with some perspective. And I did a lot of research on, the hardest thing for me was not vampires, it was parents, because I don't have kids. And this book was largely about parents. And so, like, I talked to so many of my friends who had kids and spent a lot of time with them. And everyone was super nice about it and, like, telling me how much they didn't like their kids. And that was really useful. And then, yeah, and then I did a lot of vampire reading. I mean, I've always had a soft spot for this author, Montague Summers, who was like this crazy, I think, Episcopalian minister around the 20s and 30s. And he wrote all these books like The Vampire in Europe, The Werewolf, Witches, and like they're all, I mean, he believes in all of it. And he basically just goes around and like spends a lot of time reading old accounts and letters and things like that. But then he spends a lot of time just talking to crazy people in villages. And then he writes it all down like it's fact. Like, and it's just like, and you do a lot of double takes reading his stuff. Like I was just rereading The Vampire in Europe, and he's talking about like in Silesia in like the 18th century, and this guy killed himself, but his family's like a shoemaker. No, he wasn't a shoemaker. I can't remember what he was. Shoemaker was another story, but like he kills himself, and his family doesn't want anyone to know he killed himself because then he can't be buried in the churchyard. So they bury him, but oh my God, if you kill yourself and get buried on consecrated ground, you're going to become a vampire. And he becomes a vampire, but he's just a giant dick. Like he just like comes back and like ruins dinner for it. Like keeps throwing the plates on the floor and like, throttles people, which was their nice way of saying strangling. And then they're talking, he goes, and then like he follows one of the maids one night in his household. And that's another thing I thought was interesting about the like plague vampire connection is like old timey vampires came after their family first, because of course that's who's passing on infections, people in your family. But he follows one of the maids, and like she goes outside to get like water or something late at night, and he's following her, and she starts to walk faster and he walks faster, and then she starts to run, and then he turns into a chicken and he starts chasing her, and then she like, I think she like climbs into a hayloft, and then he turns into a giant chicken, and he like grabs her by the neck and like pecks her neck so hard that it says like she couldn't eat or drink anything for a week. And I'm like, I didn't know vampires had this power to turn into giant chickens. So Montague Summers was a source for a lot of this stuff, because all the BS and giant chickens aside, he's got great folklore in his stuff. So yeah, I just really wallow in it. I just have to really, I don't know, man. Maybe it's just an advanced form of procrastination.
So, with reading about all these different vampires and all this lore, how did you then settle on the way that you wanted to represent vampires in your book?
But well, there's really only one choice you have to make about a vampire. And I feel like kind of everything follows from there. And it's supernatural or not. Because if it's supernatural, well, okay, no reflection, scared of crosses, all that stuff. But if it's actually like an actual biological creature, well, it can't turn into mist. No one can turn into mist. Like no one can alter their form like that. You can't turn into a wolf or a bat. You're gonna have a reflection. You'll show up on film, like all that stuff. But so then what's left is, I made him immortal, and so and I kind of sort of fudged it a little, because I figured, okay, if you're immortal and you're kind of dead already, then probably your internal organs don't work. But then how are you like eating? What kind of sustenance you need? And like the human blood system really only, I think, has between 7 and 9,000 calories in it, which is cool, but that's not really enough for more than a few days. And then what? You're dropping someone every like 4 or 5 days. Like you're basically, I don't know, like you're like a lawnmower gone berserk. You're just murdering people left, right, and center. So I just had to sort of deal with all those practicalities, and I figured, so blood would be something he needed, but it wouldn't be something he ate, because why would you need to eat things if you don't have internal organs that work? Um, I mean, and then you get into all kinds of stuff like, well, does he poop? And I don't think so, but like, it's just, so some things I just didn't go there because they got too complicated. But I tried to make him, for myself at least, convincingly biological, because he wasn't supernatural.
Do you think that like realism added to him might make your vampire a little scarier? Because I guess if it's supernatural, somebody could kind of be hand wavy about it. Whereas if it's something that might possibly be real, it adds something to the scare factor.
For me, it did. Yeah, I mean, and I sort of like, I have to do something I find convincing. And so I wanted to be more real. I feel like I really like applying sort of the reality principle to horror, like, because if you apply it too far, it just gets funny. Like, if you just get I mean, if you just apply the reality principle too far to vampires, you wind up with What We Do in the Shadows. So I wanted to apply just enough to get it to the point where it was scary and kind of interesting, but not goofy. It's the same with like exorcisms. You apply the reality rule. Who would do an exorcism? Well, it would probably be a minister, and a Protestant, and well, it would probably be someone really outgoing with a real evangelical bent, and so well, maybe a bodybuilder, that kind of thing. So yeah, so I had to apply enough reality to make it convincing for me, but not enough that it got silly.
I also find, because you mentioned exorcism, which of course I loved my best friend's exorcism. And both exorcism and vampires, if you follow the supernatural path too much, when you're looking at the lore behind those, you get kind of entangled with a whole lot of Catholicism and a whole
Yeah.
lot of religious implications that, I mean, I just find, as a horror reader, you talk about not wanting to be goofy. Like, I don't find that fun to read about. And um it takes it almost to a too serious of a level when somebody is trying to write, like, here's a vampire but they're an agent of Satan. um
Yeah.
that if you can kind of bend more towards the, like you said, kind of the reality principle of it, that it does I don't know, it does become more fun to read, and that was one of the things that I thought was really remarkable about the book was how it could hit this tone of it was a fun read, which I really needed right now, because
Oh,
everything's
good.
just been so terrible. So it was a lot of fun and it was escapist in the best way. But then at the same time, like the horror, you hit really hard on a lot of that because I have never been so glad in my life that my house does not have an attic in it after
The
reading this book.
attic. Oh my God. You know, the attic thing was such a last minute addition. It really came in late. And I just was like, I don't know. I just really realized we needed some kind of scene there, and that certain things needed to happen. And I was like, well, why not put it in an attic? And then I started thinking about attics I knew, and that is, I mean, it's a lot cleaner, but that's the attic in my house when I was a kid, and I was fascinated by it and totally repulsed by it at the same time. It's like roach poison everywhere and bugs, and like it smelled grimy. Yeah. So I'm glad the attic was upsetting because I found our attic growing
Oh
up
yeah.
very upsetting.
Yeah, I was reading this book along. I had a friend of mine who went and got it yesterday from her local bookstore, and I mean, we were just texting each other back and forth, going, "Holy shit, the attic!" So you did well
Oh, thank God.
with that.
But yeah, but
um,
but the religious thing is interesting because it's really I really think the only author I'm aware of who writes religious horror that I actually enjoy reading is like William Peter Blatty. Like, The Exorcist and the Ninth Configuration and Legion. I actually think and he was a comedian before he wrote horror. And I feel like his take on religion is interesting to me. But yeah, mostly I find it just falls flat. I mean, even in Salem's Lot, where Father, whatever his name is, Gallagher or something, I'm just like, oh, those were I felt like the weakest parts in the book, where it's like, and there's also Jesus power here. And it's interesting when I did an interview with uh oh God, now I'm drawing a blank. The Keep, who wrote The Keep. I'm an idiot. Oh my God, why can't I remember his name? Hold on, I'm doing something really obnoxious. Um, Oh my God, F. Paul Wilson. Jesus Christ, what is my problem? But I did an interview with Paul, and he was talking about his problem with vampires, which was even as a kid, they'd see the cross and be all repulsed and scared by it. And he's like, but I had friends who were Jewish. And so the fact that in horror there was something embedded in it that completely denied the faith of people I knew and was friends with, he's like, it always really bugged me and really like turned me off. And I thought that was a really interesting take on it because he's not wrong.
no, not not at all. Yeah, and I think Matt and Mel and I have probably talked about this a little bit, but all right. Well, since we were talking about exorcism, let's talk about my best friend's exorcism a little bit because is it did I make that up or is it set in a similar place or is it set in the
Oh,
same
the
place?
same neighborhood, exact same.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and it's just a few years later, and actually, it's different characters, but someone yesterday spotted in their copy the connective tissue because there are some references to the Langs in Southern Book Club. I mean, it's the same neighborhood. It's just a few years later.
Ah, okay. Then I'm glad I didn't make that up. One thing that I liked about this neighborhood, and I remember what I was going to say earlier, you mentioned Salem's Lot. And I feel like when you're talking about recent, I guess, within the past few decades now, but people talk about that book and that movie a lot, and I thought they were fine. But in the book, the people are already pretty horrible, like without a vampire running around, and I can't
The
remember.
worst.
They aren't they? I mean,
Like they
they're very
punch their
upsetting,
babies. Yeah, they're
right?
awful. There's even a part where
And
there's a milkman in Jerusalem's lot, and he's like, "Goddamn milk! Every time I smell it, I want to throw up." I'm like, even the milkman hates milk. Like, this is the town of assholes.
Absolutely. That was very close to what I thought. I mean, the kids were the only like redeeming thing in the and only a few of them.
Yeah,
Um
exactly.
only a few of them. But one thing that I liked about this is this book centers around a group of women, and I felt like they were genuinely friends. And for the most part, they stuck together throughout the book. And that is something that I thought stood out if you're comparing it with something like Salem's Lot. That I was like, I'm glad to read about people who I mean, it was a good cast of characters, but they were just good friends. Like that
Right.
that yeah, that group just felt very uplifting. I think that's what helped make it be fun to read, was to read about this. It was the same thing in my best friend's Exorcism. Is it's nice to see friends who aren't trying to kill each other
Yeah.
um, over the course of a horror book, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny, like, you read books about or I feel like I read books about friendship and, like, they get really, like, psychotic, and I'm like, "My relationship with most of my friends is pretty straightforward. We're friends. We like each other, and even when we annoy each other, like, okay." And that's one of the things with adult friendship, which is what this is about as opposed to Best Friend's Exorcism. Like, adult friendship, I mean, I've got friends who I'm really close with who I have nothing in common with, and sometimes I don't even like them that much, but kinda like they put up with me and my BS, so I put up with them and their BS. And you make friends as an adult, like, oh, our kids are in the same school, or oh, we've just known each other for a really long time, or we work next to each other. And it's always very qualified, but I also find that my adult friends will come through a lot more than I think my friends would have when I was in high school. And also, it's like in high school, if a friend of mine liked something and I didn't like it, that was like a crisis. Now, my adult, I don't care what they like and don't like. It's just a really different. It's a friendship that runs cooler, but a lot more stable, I think. Um, and I just wanted to sort of write about that. And I also felt like, a lot of being a friends with someone as an adult is putting up with someone who's different than you and still liking them for the stuff you like about them. I mean, I know my mom with some of her friends, they're so radically different politically or religiously or just in temperament, but they overlook that stuff or sort of grin and bear it and stay friends because you sort of get to a point in your life where that's got a lot of value. So yeah, so I didn't want to write some kind of weird contrived thing with friends who hate each other. And also I didn't want to write a book that who would want to read. One reason, well, two reasons I keep setting books in this neighborhood is one, I have very little imagination and it's where I grew up, so it's easy for me to write about. And two, I miss it. Like that neighborhood's not what it was. I still, will never feel happier or safer than I did in like summers in my neighborhood growing up in like 1984 when I was 12. I mean, and I shouldn't, right? That's like a kid's idea of the world. I didn't know what was going on behind people's doors, but like it was kind of like paradise to me. I hated it because it was my hometown and everyone hates their hometown, but it really, I love it and I miss it. So I didn't want to write something people didn't want to read. I wanted people to understand why I liked it back then.
Well, I know as a Southerner, I'm glad to see more horror books set in the South because I think New England has gotten a whole lot of horror love, and
I know.
I got I got quite tickled seeing the word cattywampus in a horror book.
Is that you've heard that before?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's also funny.
Oh
It's like
yeah.
I went through when I was reading all those books for Paperbacks from Hell, I started to realize that all these authors were writing about where they lived. So it was all around New York and like New England and stuff. And I've just hit this phase where I've been reading a ton of vampire paperbacks, and I'm going through a string where like, oh my God, this one's set in North Carolina. This one's set in Beaufort, South Carolina. This one's set in Savannah. This one's set in Florida. Like there's this whole string of them set in like the Carolinas along the East Coast. It's really weird.
So are you saying that vampires are the most southern of horror monsters?
They're very polite,
That's
and
true.
they're very polite and very lethal.
All right. So you mentioned earlier that this was called My Mom's Book Club Kills
Kill
Dracula.
Dracula, yeah,
Yeah.
terrible
So
title.
how much of this did you base on like like your mother or her friends? You mentioned that how much I'm just wondering, like, when you go back home, are these women reading this book? And are
Oh,
they gonna
yeah.
see themselves in there?
No, I mean, it's funny. I have a limited imagination, and so like everyone in my books is someone real at some point. Like it's someone I saw on the subway, it's someone I've known for a long time. But usually by the time they get to the book, they're not recognizable. They change so much, to work with the book. Like my mom doesn't see herself as Patricia. And she's not supposed to be, and she doesn't feel that way, and her book club does not see themselves in this book. I mean, they're fascinated by it and they're very happy that they like were the inspiration for this, but this is so not their book club. But I also, I magpie stuff out of real life all the time. Like as a kid, I was obsessed not just with Nazis, but with World War II. I mean, I was obsessed. And I'm sure that that was, of some concern to my parents. Like, the 19th book I brought home with like pictures of concentration camps in them and Nazis. I'm sure they were like, what do we do? He's 9. And so, and Ragtag's the name of one of the dogs in our family that we owned before I came along. And the house is very much our house. The one thing that's really on the nose in this book is, and I guess it was something that like, well, let me finish the previous thought. The previous thought is just, by the time it makes it to the page, everything's really different. But there are bits and pieces. There's houses, there's layouts, there's um, sayings and expressions and habits, but no one in real life is directly in the book at all. Um, and I don't look at Patricia and think that's my mom, because she's so not. She's so much better. But one thing that I really like to work stuff out in these books for myself, and then inflict it on other people. And so one thing that is really direct is Ms. Mary really is my grandmother. When I was really young, my dad's mom, came to live with us because she just couldn't live on her own anymore. And at the time, oh, she's just getting old. But now we'd be like, oh, she had Alzheimer's, and we really, could have done a lot of other things. And it was really, really rough. Like it was bad. She just had a really seismic impact on us because she needed so much care and attention. And my parents were really still trying to relate to her as who she was. And she wasn't that person anymore. And for me, it was terrifying because I really loved her when I was very small, but I didn't remember that very well. And I was like 11 or 10, and I didn't remember being 5 or 6, And so to me, she was just this monstrous person in the house that I couldn't hate because I wasn't allowed to. And my mom would, and I think was doing the right thing as best she could, but she would make sure she had dinner with us every night. And I was just so grossed out by it. And like, it was just so awful. But at the same time, I think ultimately it was the right thing to do. But it had this huge impact on all of us. I mean, I really think, I mean, my parents got divorced, and that wasn't the only reason they got divorced, but it sure didn't help. And but at the end of the day, it was the right thing to do. And so writing this book was a way for me, at least, to try to understand her a little better, and to try to give her, I wanted to give her a hero moment, which I kind of do in a qualified way. I don't know, I wanted to give my dead grandmother a high five, I guess. So maybe um feel bad about what happens to her. Um, maybe maybe I'm processing this very poorly. But yeah, that's the only thing in this book that's really directly like right one-to-one correspondence.
No, I think that and I won't say anything because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read the book. But yes, there are some very horrific things that happen surrounding Miss
I feel
Mary,
so
but
bad.
but I do think that she gets I don't know, I feel like she gets a couple of hero moments in the book. So
And
I liked
also,
that. There were a lot of characters I liked.
thank you. And and one of the things, really thinking back on this, it was interesting to me to wonder how she saw my mom, because I think my grandmother, you know, she was a mom, and my mom was a mom, and it's interesting to see one of my sis only one of my sisters had kids, but like it's interesting to see that there's this sort of like chain of women going back who have a really shared experience that's really unique, and something that I think they understand from the inside out, and it's very different than looking at it from the outside in.
So I guess I'm wondering because you said you don't have much of an imagination, which obviously, you know, you could write
But I
these
feel like I
books.
keep circling around this same goddamn neighborhood over and over again. Like, oh my God, what's my problem?
But I also wonder like why you not I don't know how to word this in it, but people are saying that feminist horror is having a moment, and I would put this in like a feminist horror vampire genre. And I guess I wonder how much of that was in the back of your head when you were writing this, or not at all.
Um, yeah, well, I hate the I listen, in real life, feminism's great. I mean, I hate people who say, "Oh, I'm not a feminist." I'm like, "Oh God, you don't like owning property? Like, you don't like voting? You wish people could murder you pretty much scot-free." But I feel like it's very much a political label, and I don't mean political like Republican, Democrat. I just mean a political label in terms of it defines an ideology, and I think a really good one. But I don't. It doesn't work for me to try to write a political book. It's I write about women a lot because for two reasons. One is I need my characters to be not me. I need to have a little distance between them and me, because otherwise they start turning into me, and I'm just boring. And so I need them to have some kind of difference from me. And so writing about women gives me that distance to think about them as characters and other people, and really define them. Um, and then the other reason is I'm really interested in women. I mean, I grew up with three older sisters, and was to some extent raised by a single mom for my high school years. Um, and and so a lot of my really good friends in high school and college were women, and so I've just always been around women, and I find them really interesting. And then the other thing is I find guys a little boring. I just they just don't interest me that much. Uh, Maybe I'm self-loathing. I don't know. Um, but yeah, so um, and I also find that one of the things of this book is women are not the same as housewives, but this book is definitely about housewives. It's about women whose job is raising a family and taking care of a family. And um, the thing that's really interesting to me about that is that puts them a little off to the side, because what we value is money and a job and a career, and I mean that's the stuff that's front and center, right? Like even people who are just hanging out baking cookies at home, they put it on Instagram and turn it into a brand and monetize it. Like that's considered important, but raising a family is considered less important. um, and so people who do that are put off to the side, and I find that that gives them a really interesting point of view. um, like anyone who's sort of marginalized, whether it's by their ethnicity or their religion or their gender or their job or their place in the world, has a really interesting perspective on everything else. They're just coming at it from a different direction. And so, and it was interesting to think through the economy of a housewife. Like what's valued is not money so much. What's valued is relationships. I know my kids' teachers. I know these people who live around us because I need them to watch my kid while we go out of town or look after the house, or I need people around to go to for help. And the other thing that's becomes valuable besides relationships is knowledge, right? Like, what do you do when my kid won't put on clothes? What do I do when my daughter starts cutting herself? What do I do when I can't get my kid to read? Like, and I find that like it's just a really, really different perspective on the world that really has a different way of looking at things. And it was really interesting to sort of think myself into that headspace or do the best I could without ever having been there myself.
I find that, and I don't think I realized it until I was just listening to you talk about it, but that in our culture, especially like this moment right now, when you use the word housewife, because we almost don't even have that anymore.
Yeah, I know.
Uh,
It's weird.
like we did in the 90s. And now, and I mean, I had a mom who stayed at home, when I was growing up. But now when you have the word housewife, it's, you think of
It's an
like Real
insult.
Housewife of New York, or yeah, I mean, it's something that is, yeah, it's an insult, and it's demeaned, and it's, well, they must be, mommy's drinking wine.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
don't know. Like, I really felt in reading this, like these women, the things that were important to them felt very real.
Yeah.
And I think that was nice too. And kind of jumping into it is their relationship with their family, with their children, with their husbands, with their friends. It all felt very, very real. And there was a lot of heartfelt feelings, I think, which
Oh,
is
thanks.
unusual in a book that can also make you want to like tear at your skin.
Thank you. Well, but it was also, it's weird. One of the things I did early on was I sort of picked up a lot of books that are about housewives to sort of like see what people were writing. And a lot of it was literary fiction, and it was really, really mean. Like, like women who took care of their family and raised a family and did that part of the equation. It was like they were solely defined by their limitations, and they were always unhappy and frustrated, and they always wanted something like they didn't have. And on the one hand, don't we all, right? Like, everyone wants more than what they got. Everyone's like frustrated by their limitations, but also it didn't feel real to me because I know a lot of women who um, are great. And, they're in their 70s and 80s now, and they raised families and didn't work and are really happy with that decision. And I'm like, there must have been stuff in there that they liked. And, I know my mom's been really open with me about like the stuff she loved about raising, her family. And, but when because my mom for about, gosh, probably the 32 years she was married didn't work. Um, and then she got the other end of that because when my parents got divorced, like, she hadn't gone to college. Her family just felt like college, why waste it on a girl? And so she came out of, 51 years old and divorced. She had no credit rating because she'd never had a credit card or a bank account in her name. Like, she had to sort of start from zero at 51. And so I saw both sides of that, and she never resented the decision she made, but she also didn't hide how hard it was to sort of start over. So I just felt like it would have been really inaccurate and not true to slam on the experience of raising a family and not having a 9 to 5 job. You have a like 24/7 job instead of a 9 to 5 job.
Well, what about, I'm going to switch gears a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
What, because this was set in the 90s, which I thought was really fun. And I will just go ahead and admit, I hate it usually when people will set set things back and then try to play at the nostalgia factor,
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
where yeah, where it doesn't even feel real anymore. Um, but there were a few nice little touches, as I was reading along, and I would be like, oh yeah, this is in the 90s and this is fun. Like I think at one point they mentioned going to the video store and getting So I Married an Axe Murderer.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Uh, just little fun things like that. So I'm wondering, because I know you know a lot about vampire lore. You obviously did your research on, because for somebody who does not have children, this was, I felt like, really got the kind of joys and frustrations
Oh,
of
thank
having
God.
children.
Good.
It
I'm
felt very
wiping
real.
sweat from my head.
But I don't know, like, did you do any research in doing your setting for the 90s, or did you just solely go on your own memory of it?
Oh my God, so much research. Like I went back and read so many books, like The Erotic Silence of the American Wife, listening to Prozac. I mean, all these books that were like these big 90s pop culture books, I read all of those again. And I read a ton of books about the 90s. And I rewatched things, and I ordered, I think, the book takes place, I mean, for the most part, in 1993, and I ordered the entire year's run off eBay of Southern Living magazine, just to sort of like get the like clothes and the ways rooms looked, and it was really fun. I mean, it's writing about period, it's really, really fun to sort of look at it and think, what was going on here? Like what was happening? And the 90s is a really, what was lucky for me is the 90s were a really weird decade for women. Um, in the sense that they started out with like the Anita Hill hearings, and then that sort of launched a ton of women going into Congress, more than had ever gone into Congress in American history. And then you had in like 92 or 3, I think 93, the March for Women's Lives, which was like 500,000 strong marching on Washington, mostly for reproductive rights. But it was just this huge show of force for women to sort of like, and it was on all the TV stations, carried it live, um, and you had like pretty much every major female singer songwriter getting their start in the late 80s, early 90s, from like, Janet, well, not maybe Janet Jackson, but like, Destiny's Child with Beyonce, and it formed in 1990. Missy Elliott was starting to record, Celine Dion, Alanis Morissette, um, Ani DeFranco, Tori Amos, like everyone. And then you jump to the end of the 90s, and it's like, you know, abortion providers are being shot and bombed. Um, Porn has sort of gone mainstream, and there's actually franchise strip clubs where people will actually have business meetings. Um, you have like, this huge loathing of Hillary Clinton at that point, has already sort of gotten ingrained in the culture. You look at like, the music's gotten really like, it's all new metal and very boy band and very like kind of cock rock, and so it's like you look at it and you sort of think, what happened? Like, how did we get from one to the other? And so it was interesting. I mean, it was interesting to see how the 90s kind of started out with all this potential and ended up with all this very, very conservative uh, stuff, this sort of insular, inwardly directed conservatism. I mean, and I don't use that in a political sense of like conservative right wing. I just mean people were very focused on themselves. They sort of thought that like their own happiness was the be all and end all, and everyone else could go jump off a cliff. It was really a weird decade to look at.
Having lived through the 90s, I never really thought of it in that way. But yeah, you're right. It's like so much happened in those 10 years that changed everything.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first decade where people got famous for being infamous, right? Like, and not like famous like the son of Sam, but like people like O.J. Simpson, Eileen
Mhm.
Wuornos, like Lorena Bobbitt, like people, John Wayne Bobbitt, like people sort of like got famous for doing something horrible and then turned that into a celebrity career. The late 80s was like the nightly news. 1998 is 24/7 news. Like we impeached a president. Like,
Mhm.
it's so much stuff that happened then informs where we are now. I mean, that's when the banks got deregulated. So it was so weird. I felt like I picked the decade just sort of out of convenience, and then it wound up, I lucked out.
Oh no, I was going to say you brought up John Wayne. It was John Wayne Bobbitt, right?
Was it John Wayne Bobbitt? It
Yeah.
was
Was
Lorena.
it
Yeah,
John
I
Wayne?
think so.
What was it? Yeah. Didn't he end up in porn?
Yeah. Oh my God. And I've actually seen that video. John Wayne Bobbitt. Yeah. No, I've actually seen that video. Some friends of mine and I in university, they were like, we got a copy of this. And so we sat down to watch it. And oh my God, it was horrifying. I mean, A, because he's a horrifying individual, but, B, you don't surgically reattach someone's penis and have it be seamless. I'll leave it there, but we were pretty appalled.
Oh, it's like a Frankenstein.
Yeah, yeah. You're in the ballpark.
No, but it was, and I think that was the thing, at least that I remember. I mean, I was a teenager in the '90s, so I mean, to some degree, I was kind of sheltered to a lot of what was going on growing up in the Bible Belt. Um, but there was this really weird like push and pull, especially when I think when you look at women, and I saw it a lot with the women in the book where you were still supposed to be the good wife. You were still supposed to be the woman who had dinner on the table and supported your husband, and there was a very real, again in the South, kind of religious fervor. I found it hilarious, the character Slick,
Oh yeah,
um, when she wanted to throw the Reformation party instead of a Halloween party.
those are
Um,
real.
I know. I mean, I that's why I was like, I think I knew her growing up. Like, I think she was my friend's mom. No, but and this like fear of, you know, if somebody flashes their headlights at you, there is a gang initiation. There is this real like fear that people were coming to get and destroy the good like family values. But then at the same time, you had people like John Wayne and Lorena Bobbitt who were it was like true crime turns porn. That was
Yeah,
also the flip side of the '90s. It was just a really weird, strange decade, and I don't think I
yeah.
appreciated that now.
Well, yeah, and it's weird. Like, I mean, remember Promise Keepers? Like,
Mm.
they got their start in the
Yes.
90s. Like, oh my God, I remember like Promise Keepers were everywhere for a while. Um, but the other thing I wanted to say really quickly is also like, there's this really interesting school of thought that actually I kind of subscribe to, which was the 90s was really, it did this thing to women that I think, I mean, wherever you are politically, you kind of have seen happen a few times in recent history. I mean, I feel like a little bit maybe with Elizabeth Warren, a little bit with Hillary Clinton. Um, this idea that women who kind of got out of line were really smacked down hard. I mean, and you look at Lorena Bobbitt, and growing up, I mean, man, Lorena Bobbitt, we were like, oh my God, that's insane. We made Lorena Bobbitt and John Wayne Bobbitt jokes, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, what you get down to is she was an abused wife. That was her only, she
Right.
felt like that was her only way out. And you look at Anita Hill, and everyone's, a little, what was the famous line? A little nutty, a little slutty. But like, she was a woman who was sexually harassed on her job and felt like, I can't let this guy go on to the Supreme Court without saying something. And she was a smart person. She probably had a good idea that was going to ruin her life. And there were, you look at the heat Madeleine Albright took, or even more than Madeleine Albright, Janet Reno as the Attorney General. Like, she became this huge bugbear for the far far extreme right, like the militia movements, and some of that was because of Waco and that Ruby Ridge happened on her watch. But I think some of it was also because she was a woman. And, this real vilification of women, some of whom were quite literally victims, was really a weird thing to see in the 90s, because you didn't see it so much in the 80s because you didn't see women in quite such prominent public roles. But the 90s, it was like the attitudes were still old school, but women were still able to be in these very public roles where they were in the media spotlight that existed then in such a hot way, that it was sort of like a two two flavors that didn't work well together. Old school sort of values with a new world where women could actually hold these important positions, or to get this kind of attention. And it got real ugly. And I thought that was always like, I think there's a book, I can't remember what it's called, but there was a book about this that I didn't read, but I read the reviews of it. And that talks about this a lot, and just how the 90s were when we sort of got a taste for vilifying women in public.
Not to bring it all the way back to Dracula, but I'm going to. That was a lot of what was happening during the time when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, was this idea of, Victorian family values, but then a new woman. And you had, the character of Mina, with her typewriter,
Yeah.
very much
And
being
her
that
shorthand.
kind of, right. She was doing dangerous stuff. But that was very much kind of a threat to the way they saw how femininity should be expressed, or how women should behave in the family unit or in society. So, it does make a lot of sense that vampires, especially male vampires, exist in time periods where you have that kind of, like you said, the two flavors that aren't mixing very well.
Yeah.
And the
And
changing roles.
yeah, and also let's give a moment for Mina Harker, man. She is one of the great characters in 19th century literature. Like, Mina Harker, everything happens to her that's terrible. And every time something happens that's supposed to make her weaker, she turns it into a strength. It's like, you're a woman, you're weak. Okay, well, I'll keep the notes and come up with all the connections that no one was seeing. Okay, you're going to be really stressed out and upset because your friend just got killed. Well, actually, I see a lot of stuff here, and that motivates me even more to go after Dracula. Okay, well, now Dracula's bitten you, and he's like in your head with ESP. Hypnotize the fuck out of me and use that to hunt him down. Like, everything that happens to her that's supposed to sideline her just makes her stronger and better. I love her so much.
Oh yeah. Yeah, she's the I will say she's the reason I have read that book multiple times. Like, it's not Dracula
Absolutely.
at all.
Yeah. Well, and in that book, he's like this old dude with hairy palms and like bad breath, and he smells like he sucks. And Van Helsing's like a know-it-all, and Jonathan Harker's like a total dork bag, and all those bumbling suitors are just idiots. Like, she's the best of the bunch. Did you read Gwendolyn Christie's cursed? I think it's cursed story. To the what's it called? To the 8 people who killed me.
The Lucy,
The
yeah.
Lucy one? So good.
Yeah, she's so talented.
I'd never read
Yeah.
any of her
Yeah,
stuff
it is.
before,
It's
but
good.
yeah, that was the first thing, and I love that because it made me like Lucy, because I'm like, yeah, you're right, poor Lucy. Like, these dudes are like, we're just gonna transfuse some blood into you. That should work real good, and then she gets sick and dies. It's like, was that a surprise? Did no one see that coming?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think Mel's a big fan of her novel. What is it? The Rust Maidens?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I knew about Rust
Um,
Maidens, but I hadn't read her stuff before, so I'm definitely hunting that down now.
Oh, it's so good. It's a good book.
I'm sure people have asked you this like a million times, but do you have a favorite vampire now that you've written yours?
Mm. Yeah, totally. Well, there's sort of like 2 I really like. I like Dracula. Like, come on, that book is amazing. And I've always like, as a kid, Salem's Lot was my go-to. I'm not sure it holds up quite so well as an adult. I don't love it as much as I did, but The two vampires that I really, really, really dig and would recommend to anyone is a writer named Florence Marriott wrote a book called Blood of the Vampire that I'm sure you guys know. And it's like basically like a manic pixie dream girl who's just exhausts everyone to death. She's like an energy vampire and she just wants to talk to you and be your friend. And eventually you just get sicker and sicker and die. And I just love, I mean, the book has a lot of issues. Problematic, I think was the term y'all used. But like, I just love the idea that it's like, this girl's friendly, too friendly. She's gonna make you die. She's so friendly. But then the other vampire I really love, and this is, I only read this book, God, probably like 8 or 9 months ago for the first time. But I finally read Whitley Strieber's The Hunger that the movie's based on, and it's
Oh,
amazing. It's so good. Have you read it?
I have not read it. I love the movie,
And the
but I have
movie's
not read the
great.
book.
The book is amazing. And someone told me, because I recommended it to someone, and they're like, that book has a lot of sex in it. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's a paperback from like the 80s. What do you think? So caveat emptor, like it has a lot of, but it's great. It's one of the few vampire books I've ever read that actually creeped me out. Like by the time you get to the end, because the woman who Catherine Deneuve plays in the movie, she really likes her victims. She's in love with them. And it makes it really complicated and really gross. I mean, you wind up fully in toxic relationship territory with this. Um, it's really worth it if you haven't read the book, and it's a fast read.
Okay. All right. Now you sold me. I'll read it.
Well,
That's
because it sort
awesome.
of does this thing where, like, there's always this problem with vampires where it's like, well, if they suck your blood, some people turn into vampires and some people don't. And, like, why do some do and some don't? And this book kind of deals with that in a really unpleasant way. It's great.
Oh, good. I just read Fledgling by Octavia Butler.
Oh, yeah.
And kind of her take on the vampire. And I always laugh thinking about how she handled that idea of, do your victims turn vampire? And I think the line in the book was something along the lines of, well, that's ridiculous because if a dog bites you, you don't expect to turn into a dog, do you?
Oh,
Uh,
that's great.
and I was like, I appreciated the way she handled that because that is something you have to, who's gonna die, who's gonna turn into a vampire, who's gonna um yeah, what's gonna
Yeah.
happen with this exchange. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Which I had to deal with in the most disgusting way possible in my stupid book. Um, but so I was going to ask you though, wait, Fledgling's a vampire book?
Fledgling is a vampire book.
Oh my God, I have to read.
Yeah.
Octavia Butler is one of those writers who sort of like I've read, Kindred, and I've read some of her short stories, which I love the one, and I can't remember the name, but it's about the aliens and people are sort of their little like blood bags, and they keep them as pets, and it's so great. But I haven't read enough, and I read The Seed and the Sower, but I haven't read enough of her stuff. I really need to.
Yeah, it's really good. It was her last novel before she passed, and I think she had intended to write more because there's a lot of extensive world building. There's a lot of like philosophy because the vampires they're not, she takes that they're not supernatural. They're another like species. And I don't know, it's really fascinating because she builds out their culture and they have their own language and they have their own, written down mythology. And it's really a good book, I think. So
Oh, that's really
that's
cool.
my
Yeah, no,
recommendation. All right, if I read The Hunger, you have to read Fledgling.
all right, no, I'm game. I just wrote it
Awesome.
down.
All right, well, I guess that's all we have. Thank you, Grady, for coming on and answering all of our questions.
Oh, dude, thanks for having me. So one thing I did want to say is right now I'm part of class of spring 2020, which is like authors who have books coming out right now, which is for coronavirus reasons, a weird time to have your book coming out. I mean, Steve Graham Jones, I think his book just got bumped from next week or the week after to July. Paul Tremblay's got a book coming out in July. It's a lot of people have books coming out in this chunk and in this summer. And I know people want to know what to do to help authors. And for me, it's too late. My book's already out, but pre-order their books. That's a real vote of confidence in an author, and it really sends a message to bookstore buyers and to their publisher that this book needs more attention, and it gets more resources if their pre-orders start to go up. And it also helps if gives them a good shot at the New York Times bestseller list, because pre-orders count as one of your first week sales, and that's really important. So if you want to help an author who has a book coming out right now, pre-order their book. And the other thing I want to say is, look, I got no problem with Amazon. I ordered 3 things from Amazon this week. I like Amazon. But right now, the people who are really at risk, Amazon's not going anywhere, are independent bookstores. So if you're going to pre-order something, do it from an independent bookstore. They are our neighbors. They're our friends. They are a vital part of this community and the fabric of all our communities. And a lot of them are facing scary, scary times where they don't know if they're reopening right now. And you're going to pay a few bucks more, like I think on Amazon, Southern Book Club's $15. And from your local bookstore, it's going to be about 21 or 22. But I feel like that $5 or $6, think of it as like a grant you're giving them to keep them alive, or a surcharge on having a community. Right now, Buxton Books, which is the bookstore my mom goes to, my mom can't go outside right now. She has lung disease, so she needs to self-isolate. And they're dropping books off for her on her front porch and checking in to make sure she's okay every week. Amazon's not going to do that. That's not their job. Your local bookstore knows who you are. It knows what you like. You're going to be sad when they're gone. So pay those extra few bucks. Do something to give these guys a little bit of hope right now, and just keep them going. This is the time when your local bookstore needs you badly. So you want to help an author, pre-order their book. You want to help a bookstore, pre-order their book from your local bookstore.
Well, I don't think I could have said it better. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's all my pontificating.
Yeah. Support your local bookstores, support your authors. There are some great books coming out right now, and I highly recommend the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. It is the perfect kind of fun, escapist horror in the middle of all this insanity. So I think that will be the last I say about that. And thank you again, Grady, and we'll be talking to you in 2 weeks.